Okay, when you see this image, it means it's time to pause and reflect. You'll see others like it. Welcome back, everybody. This module and the next will focus on ways to approach working on wicked problems. That might sound a bit process-oriented when these problems are extremely important to you and to all of us and need work right this minute. But as you will hopefully see and appreciate, the way in which we think about problems and approach working on them will actually determine the array of solutions that we can use and approaches to them, for example. It will also open up successive coalition work around these issues and these problems, and it will help us understand more about the extent to which the solution approach actually reflects the characteristics of the wicked problem. We've all been likely part of groups that seek to solve wicked problems with a linear, simplified solution that really does not, in fact, address the complexity or the multi-level nature of the problem. We might have been part of groups where we felt the solution was predetermined and we're just there to stamp it. It's always frustrating. So let's take a moment to reflect on ways to approach our work with wicked problems. So pause for a moment here and consider the words of Seville Kushner. I need to move so you can see it. I want you to think about what this means. So pause the video for a minute after I ask these questions and really read this statement by Dr. Kushner and consider, what does this mean to you? That programs are microcosms of democratic society. What does that mean? And what does it mean for the work you're going to do in the future? So I recommend that you stop the video, take a minute to really think about what this means and why I'm asking you to think about this in this course. Before we go much further, it's important to continue to revisit an important notion. You see, evaluation research is not neutral. It is not neutral, it's not even objective. I would suggest to you no research is neutral or objective. So I've already shared a comment or two about the linearity of evaluation research and our research methods and tools that we have in a Western context been trained to use. What we should all remember is that methods of research and evaluation research itself seek to simplify and homogenize. It's to help us make sense of something. It's not bad. It just is what it is. So while this is exceedingly helpful, as I've shared for a variety of projects, the nature of wicked problems requires tolerance and space for complexity. This is not a time to simplify, but instead to understand, lift under the rocks, see what's there, try to understand it all, without trying to predetermine what it's going to mean. So please also note that the way in which we approach evaluation research can make many and valuable contributions to understanding or unpacking wicked problems or planning responses to wicked problems when we approach with an open mind, ecologically oriented, community-based, and transdisciplinary mindset. Frameworks help us approach the work on wicked problems. Their use is more for our orientation to our work, how we're going to be prepared to think about the work versus methods to, quote, do the work. They do inform methods, though. So frameworks, they're helpful to us, and you don't have to take them hook, line, and sinker. You can take pieces of them, you can see how they fit, you can renegotiate their use with your partners. So don't feel constricted by them. Their value is actually in their ability to help us understand not only the phenomena itself, but the connections between elements, the directionality of those connections, certainly, and even the sustaining environment that enables or recreates and creates the problems that we're experiencing. Frameworks provide what we call explanatory value. So some frameworks are better than others for adaptation or for using parts of them. And you'll find as you start learning about some frameworks, or if you have some that you're bringing to this course, you'll see which ones are the most helpful. So let's review for just a second. You've seen these bubbles. They will not leave you. They will haunt you through the course. Sorry. This image depicts the characteristics of wicked problems, as you know. Your reading and our module will introduce you to the ecological framework and components of it. You will also review the social ecological framework as an example of an ecological framework. So now it's a framework and a framework. The ecology or the complex ecologies is really more of a rubric or a overarching umbrella in which ecological frameworks or models might sit. In this course, we will discuss having an ecological approach or mindset when we talk about wicked problems. Hobson and Cram offer a great explanation about this in the text, so I will not repeat what you see in the text. I'll highlight things that I think might be easily missed, or I might review a couple things that I think are really critical, but generally I am trusting that as adult learners, you've got this. And so just let me know if things aren't working out or if you want more clarity. Happy to do it. In fact, the entire Hobson and Cram text is worth the read because you will have both framework comments as well as application examples. So that's really a helpful thing to see. Well, how do people use this and how is it applied? So the concept of ecology refers essentially to multi-layered complexities of existence across space and time and experience. So think about that again. Multi-layered complexities of existence across space, time, and experience. This approach also considers, Smith will argue, a diversity of beings, so think humans as well as non-humans, as important to problems and affected by them. I think that's not hard to think about when we think about environmental consequences, for example, but that's not all. What do the mountains know? The ecological approach, it represents diverse natural, physical, social, spiritual, organizational realities, settings, programs, and policies. Those are all examples of what might be multi-level, what might be functioning, right? So finally, as you saw in your reading, if you've read it before this video, or you will read it, you will see it, Hobson and Cram recommend that we attend to the 3 R's they are calling relationships, responsibilities, and relevance. Whenever we approach evaluation on wicked problems, that through the R's, we will be assured to pay attention to the ecologies, essentially, is what they mean. Other authors in that very same volume add restoration and resilience so that social justice can be achieved. These 5 R's then, instead of 3, are values, which will form the basis of our ecological approach to wicked problems. So I'm going to unpack them, but not in this module. I'll put up another quick unpack for the R's, and I may separate them so that you can get back and forth with them easily as you wish for your own learning. Again, feedback is always appreciated so that I know how well you're experiencing things and if you need them in a different manner to help you learn and thrive in the best way that you can in this program. So let's take a minute here, though, and focus on your wicked problem and think about, just for a minute, what the complex ecologies might just be. You can stop the video for a minute and just write it down. Just take a piece of paper and write, put at the top of the paper your wicked problem that you're choosing right now. And you might still be figuring out what that's going to be, but choose it for now for this application. And just take a minute, even if you haven't read anything, and think about, try to name as many components or elements of the complex ecologies around your wicked problem. So first, complex ecologies really refers to an overarching frame, in which the social ecological model and many others sit. It is perhaps the most broad, but it does help orient us to ecology around in which we actually do our work, in which we actually live, and in which we will do our evaluation research. The reading in Hobson and Cram, of course, this image is from the cover of the book, draws our attention to the fact that problems exist in multi-level, non-linear, or complex environments and ecologies. Let's consider one aspect of ecologies, and that is the social environment. I mean, just think about it. What are they comprised of? What makes up a social environment? Well, they're comprised of several things. Yes, people are individuals, and they also interact in small groups, dyads, triads, small groups. We also have groupings like family units or subpopulations, right? The LGBTQI plus community, or some would argue cisgender and non-binary and trans, right? These are defined by circumstances in life, certainly, but there are also those communities that are defined by place, or where we might live, like the Upper East Side neighborhood or community, or where we were born, the Navajo Nation, a Jewish family, in a refugee camp. Several other reasons, including but not certainly limited to shared beliefs like religious communities, a political community, or again, as I'd mentioned, refugees, circumstance. So these are ways to think about just one aspect of ecology, and that's the social environment. This one aspect of ecologies in which our wicked problem resides, or our problems reside, is complex in and of itself. And it's like peeling an onion, if you've ever done that. Each layer is its own onion. It's an onion in its own right, but we've got to seek to understand them, these layers, and how they not only are an onion in and of itself, but fit together to be an onion, the bigger onion, as well as to taste a certain way. Maybe this example is not going so well. What might this mean, for example, in the context of your wicked problem? I don't mean onions. I mean, what might it mean to be examining so many multi-layers of just one aspect? If you've ever seen Alice in Wonderland or read the book, you'd be like, wow, we're going down all these tunnels and just going further and further into complexity. That's exactly the kind of exploration we are going to be about and going to be engaged in this program. So looking at this slide, you might think, that is probably what you might think. But the goal here, this is just an example, by the way, you do not have to study this slide. This is an example of a complex ecology. And you might think that the goal is to develop a complex but likely linear depictions, which this is quite linear, of our ecologies. So you can see lines and they go in certain ways and it looks complex, but there are complex components, and yet everything seems linear. Not probably the way it really is, although it's a helpful tool. Again, homogenize, simplify, right? But the caution here, what I really want you to appreciate is that while these tools are helpful, the caution is to remember that they're not, that these are nonlinear relationships, what you might see, unless there's some evidence to suggest otherwise. So if you're looking at evidence behind your wicked problem that suggests certain things cause something else, well, then you know you have a directional arrow, right? As you're thinking about mapping out problems. But I'm just pausing to show you this now because we really do think in these ways in the Western context. But truly, this example from Gonzalez and colleagues, it's a great example, but it is somewhat still linear. So in this example, so Gonzalez tried to put forward a simplified model here. Recent reports had been suggesting that the development model under which the Galapagos Island was functioning, tourism, et cetera, had turned unsustainable. And that the unique values of the archipelago might be seriously at risk, including environments. So what Gonzalez and colleagues did was map the social ecological situation in multiple scenarios over time to provide insights, essentially, into the origins of the current crisis that the communities found themselves in. It might also yield, there was hope that they would yield possible management alternatives. So here you're looking at a broad systems perspective, conceptualizing the archipelago as a complex social ecological system, past, present, and possibly future. Trends, certainly they were explored using what they used was a resiliency theory. So they came at it from strengths and resilience as a perspective to understand essentially the dynamics of the system. So what was resiliency about? What do we want to think about? Think about the 5 R's, right? 4 major historical periods were considered as they developed this time period and this mapping. They were characterized, they were analyzed using a cycle metaphor. So you can start to hear these names and these frames that people choose in their research. You'll do the same. So don't worry if you don't know what I'm really referencing here. Essentially know that a framework was chosen. Some assumptive theories, assumptions, and approaches were chosen that might characterize important aspects of the realities chosen by the people engaging in this design exercise, if you will, in order to characterize and understand the wicked problems facing the Galapagos. So the situation was characterized in essence as a prolonged series of crisis events, followed by renewal attempts that hadn't yet been completed. So this is just one example of how an ecologically informed approach might look. But again, note the caution here is being too linear. So now I'm going to introduce just one example of a framework, and that is the social ecological framework. If any of you are in public health, you probably heard about Bronfenbrenner's work. So essentially, Yuri Bronfenbrenner was the first to fully develop this model. I'm calling it a framework, but it's called the social ecological model, or SEM, but it's really a framework, and I'll explain this in a minute. So after World War II, essentially, social scientists were critical of simplistic and linear tools. We've never quite left them, by the way, to understand multi-level complex problems. So they needed better tools. And Bronfenbrenner essentially was one who developed this and developed the ecological framework around human development. So this soon morphed into what we are discussing here as the social ecological framework, and it can be adapted. But let me just stop here because I've thrown around 2 terms: framework, which I defined earlier, and model. What's the difference? So a framework indicates the components, dimensions, and directions of a project or study prior to a methodological approach. It may also be applied afterwards to say, well, this looks like this, and this framework can help explain what we observed. Yeah, probably. But frameworks are always helpful at the beginning because it sets what is most valuable when you think about an approach, et cetera. And as I mentioned, it opens an array of possible exploration methods. Models, on the other hand, are used to develop really after a study. You're going to model what you see. Again, explanatory value. Frameworks can provide it. Models are clearer. But really, SEM is a framework, not a model. So I realize it's strange to call a model not a model, but it's really not. So it's the social ecological framework that I'll introduce it to you in this way. And it will guide how you might consider working on your wicked problem as an example of an ecological approach. So one way of showing the model, I'm going to share an adaptation of this so you can see. Now, note the levels. So I think these are pretty straightforward: individual level, interpersonal, community, organizational, structural. You can adapt some of these, but just note these are the levels that we experience. And here's an adaptation example around health. But a couple take homes I want you to see that they use similar, to understand health, they use similar nomenclature for each level. and identified what components mattered most. So under natural environment, they were focused on air, water, weather, topography, right? Those kinds of things. So you can add layers to the model, for example, or name them differently based on what you're hearing, based on what your community partners are telling you are important. You could build it together, create it, co-create it. You can interpret each layer according to the project that you have. What is meaningful? What is important? What should we call this? So I work a lot in the policy environment, and that's not shown here. So I might show policy and systems between built and social environment, or I might put it between built and natural environment. It's hard to say. Policy-like programs are social constructions that embody or reify power relationships and repeat them and recreate them. So, that's important structural indicators. But again, you could decide otherwise based on your wicked problem. So what I'm showing you here is it's a shirt you can change around and work on and wear in a way that works for you, okay? Useful. This is a useful template to help you think about the complexities. So as a first introduction of a framework, I think it's a good place to start. So having said all of this, now it's your turn. And in the assignment, I will ask you to consider your wicked problem, describe it briefly, and then use a social ecological framework to talk about it, to consider the elements of its ecologies. Now, is this a final assignment? Oh my God, no, it's your first one. So what I'm really looking for is your attempt to truly understand how you might apply the use of a framework to think about your wicked problem. Now, it might require that you know a little bit more about your wicked problem. So if you chose a problem that you really didn't know too much about, but you think it's important, you might need to do a little homework about it. But if it's a problem you have lived with and experienced or studied in the past, you probably have a ton of information to help you initially apply this framework to just start thinking about the complexities. I would recommend as you do this assignment to pull up these slides, certainly, and also to look back at the bubbles so that you can say, okay, wicked problems are characterized in a certain way. How would those issues of my actual wicked problem fit in a multi-level, how would they be arrayed in a multi-level manner? I really look forward to seeing your work, and you'll have the chance to comment about one another's as well. Thanks so much.